All right, welcome everybody to the Polymath Project, sponsored by Blue Liner. This is Arman. It is Wednesday, yes, September 13th, 2023, losing track of time. I'm really honored to have one of my best and oldest friends, Shahab Salemy, who's been on an amazing journey that we'll hear about today. He's currently the VP of Product and Design at Dick's Sporting Goods after a decade-plus stint in various roles in product development and tech and innovation at Nike. Shahab, what's up, brother? How are you, man?
Good, good. Nice to see you, Armand. It's always fun to talk to you. I feel like every time we talk, I learn something. So it's always a pleasure.
Likewise. You know, we obviously took very different paths, and we'll want to come back to that later. But you know, since graduating and spending 3 years together at Columbia, playing on that field, here we are. How many years later? Let's not. But 20. I lost track. It's at least 25 years, right?
Yeah.
Where are you sitting right now?
So I'm down in Austin, my home for the last year, but yeah, just sitting in my home office, you know, have my favorite Jordan 11s behind me as always, but yeah.
Good stuff. So is your role with Dick's that you've been at for about a year plus now, right?
Yeah, a year plus. Been there about about almost 18 months or so. So I manage digital product design, which is essentially kind of the back end work of everything that's a digital product into our ecosystem. So everything from consumer facing things like the app, the website, to tools that you'll see in the stores, of whether you're interacting with it as a consumer, digital tools that we have, digital walls, or tools for our associates in the stores, all the way to things that we use internally. So you can think about like our internal website, our systems, our what we use in the supply chain. So we manage probably a portfolio of maybe 100 plus different products across the ecosystem. And that's kind of our like broader kind of mandate. And then on top of that, we kind of manage and help co-create more of a transformational story as Dick's is going from really being a traditional sports retailer to evolving to be more of a sports related company. And that's a bit of like how we serve our athletes, or we talk about consumers as athletes, and trying to provide more than just product recommendations, but really start providing more of a service layer in terms of how do we actually help them become better athletes. We're early on the road. We have a few initiatives out in the marketplace, but that's where we see the future going, which is a much more integrated version of holistically serving that athlete, of which product is a huge element of that. But the journey into product and what you do once you get the product, I think is also as interesting.
That's amazing, man. That's really amazing. How long, I mean, I know you've been at Dick's only for a short time. How long has the company kind of made this an initiative? I know with Nike, and we'll get to that, it's been a long-term initiative. And how old is that initiative at Dick's?
Well, I think it's so the vision of the company changing to becoming the greatest sports company in the world is only a few years old. So like that statement that was put out and publicly acknowledged is only a few years old. I think the work of how to get there is around that timeline. So I'll use like an example. You know, a few years ago, we opened up a door that we call the House of Sport, and the mandate of that door was build a store that if it opened up across the street from us would put us out of business. It wasn't necessarily to scale that concept. It was more of like, well, let's just see what would happen. What would you do? And so constraints were off. It's like, just go. Creativity was launched. What was built was a 200,000 square foot, basically arena of sorts that has everything from climbing walls to half a football field to what we call the House of Cleats, which is like every cleat you can imagine, completely integrated. And it became more of an experience for consumers to come in and to really engage in the whole journey of sport. And so whether you come in there to shop, or you come in there because you're interested, or you come in there because you want to actually try and play, it became an environment in which to do that. And it was really fascinating because not only was that we learned a lot, but one of the biggest learnings we realized is it was actually exceptionally profitable to do this. So we went from that one store concept to, in the next several years, we'll open up 100 of these around. It won't be not all the platforms will be that large, but the idea will still be the same, which is these environments that you can come into and experience sport in a different way. And that's one idea. And you could think about how we could bring that concept into a digital world. You could see how you could bring that concept in partner environments. You know, we have platform called Game Changer that, if you have a kid that plays baseball, you're probably familiar with it, where we basically record youth baseball sports. We provide that back to the team and to the parents so they can track their kid, they can help schedule their games, they can watch their games. So if you're 3,000 miles away, you can see it. What's fascinating about that platform is in a single month, we have more data on baseball games than the history of MLB. And that's just the power of like youth sport and this idea of how much information we can generate. And there's such a desire from both the kid who's playing the game, wanting to track their stats, how am I doing, as well as parents in the ecosystem wanting to support that play. So when we talk about sport, it really starts dimensionalizing what that means. And so these are, again, a couple of examples that over the years we've been going to, and it's like they're all little pieces of the puzzle as we go on this journey, but it'll be a long journey. It's not this is very much a wave of transformation of the company, but exciting to be on.
That's extremely exciting. And I definitely want to put an asterisk on that with you for Game Changer, because as you know, we have basement sports and there's a lot of touch points, where we have things like stats and streaming, and it's more for really the in-home environment. I call it more like disorganized sports as opposed to like organized youth sports, like families bringing that concept into a house. And but I don't want to take up this call with that, but I definitely want to put an asterisk and talk to you another time about that, because I think there's I love that vision and I completely share that concept. And I think about in other retail experiences how we see so many retailers fearful of Amazon and what these big online retailers have done to challenge at every level, every type of more standard brick and mortar retailer. And the answer always comes to mind. It's about the experience, right, that you could have in the store that you can't have if you're solely buying online, or obviously it could be integrated, but there's something that happens when you get into that little mini rock climbing wall or the experiences you talked about that it's hard to replicate through augmented reality. I mean, we can try and put on headsets, and I know that's part of the roadmap, I'm sure, for you guys as well. Amazing, man, amazing. So let me backtrack with your career, because a decade at Nike, right? We got to talk about that a little bit. Nike, you said, you talked about it a little bit in our pre-talk, being like aiming for digital first, to become a digital first company. Do they think, and do you think that they achieved that? Is that I mean, obviously it's always waves, but
I mean, I don't think, I think that it's I think directionally moving forward, yes. I mean, I think it's a little bit, and I'd say this candidly of, when I think about how technology plays a role in companies' journeys, there's essentially three types of companies that you can think about their world of technology. There's the digital natives, Apple's, Amazon's, Google's, or the like they don't really talk about a digital strategy. That is their strategy. It's like how they do. And so it's how they compete and how they differentiate. Then you have individuals who realize that technology is as much a partner of everything that you do, as much as merchandising is, as much as product is, as much as sales as everything else. And it's seen on par because you realize the power that it can provide. And then you have companies who still probably look at technology as IT and kind of have more of a servant kind of leader kind of relationship with technology. That third chapter is the death zone. Like if companies who don't appreciate that technology is on par with everything else they're doing, and in some cases it is their value proposition, you will ultimately die a slow death and maybe a fast death depending on the industry. And the reason it is because it is such this idea of how much technology integrates in everything we do, and it's integrated in all the things we do, is as real in the consumer space as it is in the business environment. So Nike realized this. And if you think about like the history of Nike's gone on many waves of innovation and has a great spirit of innovation and change, and I have nothing but respect for the company. They've been, even when I was there early days, it was almost 12, 13 years ago, there was a lot of digital platforms that the company was working on, but they were very siloed in how to use this technology to help this experience. Over the last probably 5, 6 years plus, it was more saying, how do you think about technology across everything we do and start integrating it? So this notion of whether you're a footwear designer and you have an idea, starting in a digital environment has a lot of implications and benefits, how you deal with your, your manufacturing partners. And if you can move to a digital environment, really speeds the time of innovation. Once you get into your supply chain and how to use technology to both track your product and make sure you have the right product in the right place, completely elevates your game. And obviously in the consumer, there's a lot of elements. And so I think Nike's done a great job of thinking about all those areas and really moving that. The challenge of any company that sits in the middle is because they're not native, it is not the first thing that comes up, right? If you were to take an executive at Nike a few years ago and you'd say, tell me what it means to like bring a product to market, regardless of what function they're in, they could tell you that. But if you were to ask them, tell me the technology that enables that, it would have been a challenge. Today, that's different. If you're executive Nike, just I'd say if you're an executive of any company that's in that second brand, technology has to be a language that you're willing and capable of speaking because it's just as important as those other elements. So that's why I think it's the evolution, not only like a company like Nike, but many in the middle. Eventually, we won't have this conversation, right? There's this word digital transformation, I think had a time and place. I think companies who continue to use it are on the early side of the curve because we have transformed. It's not about a digital transformation anymore. If you're doing that, you're well behind where you need to be. Now it's more of like, how are you utilizing the technology and integrating it more thoughtfully across the ecosystem, which is really the power. This siloed approach, which I think is how companies used to work, is also very challenging.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because language is always changing. And like I know in your title and some of the history it was that like, hey, part of the digital transformation team at Nike. And so how do you, what's the next level of language? Like, how do you describe what you do if it's now past, into that next stage? I mean, it's just.
Well, I think the word, this idea of, transformation is not that the single word is not going to go away, and how you transform and kind of evolve and innovate is critical. So like when I think about what we're doing at Dick's, we don't say we're digitally transforming. We talk about there's this kind of evolution, transformation of the experience we're bringing to the athlete. Technology is a key piece of that.
Right.
But it's not something that we don't lead with it for many reasons. One, because that's something about what I was mentioning before is like, if we said, oh, we're going through a digital transformation, it's kind of, I think it's a little bit historical way of thinking about what we're doing, as opposed to we're trying to move forward. And I'd also say not every company needs to be at a moment of these huge inflections. Like sometimes you just want to do what you're doing just a little bit better. But the idea of having thought and process of how you want to get better, innovation should be at the heart of every company's strategy in some capacity. So for us, at Dick's, it's a different perspective. Like, Nike, when I was kind of leaving, going through what they call the consumer direct offense, this idea of being more thoughtful around taking a bit more ownership of their supply chain, opening more stores, shutting down some of their wholesale accounts because they're trying to lean up, I think was a very viable strategy. And that's a lot of what they thought about. Since then, they've actually reopened some of the wholesalers, appreciating the need to partner through that. But like, I commend any company who's willing to take some chances and to continue to try and elevate and evolve, because, the only thing we can't do is stand still. There's no, you'll never win by not moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's well said. That's well said. Is there, I've got a few other topics here, but before moving on specifically from your role at Dick's, besides, Game Changer and this amazing like concept store that you said is now looking to expand, any other kind of trending or upcoming or current initiatives that you can talk about at Dick's?
Not much that we can probably talk about, but I think, it's hard to not have a conversation about anything innovation and not talk about like generative AI and like the work that will, fundamentally transform. When we think about, I would say something that, probably thousands are not saying right now. It's the most exciting technology that's, come since the internet, and some would argue even more exciting than the internet. And so this journey of how to really partner and use the technology and be thoughtful in a way that's going to feel in some ways seamless, but in other ways safe, is something I think we're all thinking about. And so whether that's, this idea of like the end of search and moving to a new way of search, so how we think about getting product, or if it's a way of how you train individuals, or it's a way of how you link systems in the back end, I think it'll, over a period of time, will fundamentally change everything that we do. I think we're just at such an early place right now that the best thing that I think, whether it's Dick's or other companies can do, is really have thoughtful experimentation. And so I think that's an area that's very interesting. We're spending a lot of time on it. And, I think if any company's not at least thinking about it, or having some folks dedicated to it, it's probably a miss. What the future will be, it's if I was smart enough to know that, I probably would be here right now. But
yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, though, it's part of that same transformation conversation in those buckets. It's like that's one of those forefront items that if you're not even talking about it, if you're only talking about it, you're already a little bit late. But to be dedicating resources to working on experiments and in-house and with partners certainly makes sense. So let me ask you this from a standpoint of, working with partners, and obviously you guys are creating your own and acquiring companies and building your own in-house, but you're also, I'm sure there's a vast, partner network, including Nike and other great brands. Any advice or recommendations for people that might want to, hey, how do we work with Dick's? What kinds of things are they looking for? Maybe for smaller brands. We know obviously working with Nike and big brands is going to be natural, but how do smaller sports related companies, organizations maybe think about, a couple of best practices to possibly
well, I mean, I think so. I mean, formally, we have a fund. We have a small fund that we launched this past year. So there's actually an environment by which, if companies are interested, we have a team that reviews the opportunities. We integrate with that team, and so there's an environment which we do invest in early stage companies and think about that. We, similar to many corporates who have similar types of vehicles, our strategy is not to get return from that investment, right? We're not investing as investors. We're investing with the idea of how can we help support those companies going forward and ultimately kind of integrate and help them in an ecosystem that works for us as well. So I think as companies approach, and I think I've done a lot of business development in my past at many companies. I think when you're dealing with a corporate, I think really having a sharp understanding of what their investment strategy is critically important, because there are companies who will build funds and they're doing it to drive return. It's a very different partner experience. You're looking for different things from them. They're looking for different things for you, versus a company who's like, we're here because an early stage, investment to acquire. Like when I worked in medical devices, most of the investments were in that direction, that ultimately you're using it as an advanced R&D arm. And you're kind of saying, we're not ready, but you're ready. Eventually, when you're one or two milestones later, we will, if everything's working, we'll most likely acquire you. And that's been like the history of medical device industries, to grow through acquisition in many environments. With a company like Dick's, or in our world, it is finding that balance between an area that maybe is not our area of expertise, but could be directionally innovative, or candidly could just solve an existing problem that we're having. Because it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's so front facing, it could be very back facing. And so when I was at Nike, we invested in a company called Select that was working on really about demand planning was their tool. And they're using AI and ML tools to basically become smarter in demand planning. They had a lot of other customers. Nike just happened to be one of their customers. We learned a lot. We invested, and ultimately we acquired that business. Why? Because we're like, you're doing something we want to do, and we want to advance that to your direction for us. So it was a problem the company had. Initially was a supplier, became an acquisition target, and were brought in. The same thing I could see happening in companies like Dick's, where I think the key is to work your way into whatever you're doing, find that business partner within the business that is focused on that area.
Sure.
And get connections to them. They will usually be very open to express the areas they're interested in. And it's not about the long-term strategy. You're not really disclosing a lot as much as disclosing needs. If you feel you can solve that need, then the conversation will naturally begin. And then different companies have different vehicles in which to do that. So whether it's, for us, we can invest, we can obviously, partner on a POC, we can just monitor, so that would be my kind of macro advice.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And would you think, I know this maybe not exactly be your area, but would you kind of apply the same type of advice for a company not necessarily looking to get acquired or sell their technology, but just like a pure supplier into like the CPG, like someone's got some new sneakers or something innovative, some clothing that has some technology built in or something.
Yeah. I mean, we do that. I mean, we've looked at companies where ultimately the question is, we may just become part of our merchandising strategy.
Sure.
And we have a huge merchandising organization that's constantly looking at kind of what should be our assortment, what brand should we work with, how should that come to life. I won't use names, but there are some of those companies that we have looked at from an investment standpoint, but ultimately the end goal may be we're just going to bring them into a merchandising environment in our store and have an elevated experience with them because it's something that we think about what they're doing that's really interesting and innovative. And whether that's because we think we can sell a lot of them, or whether that's because we think it's an interesting inroad to have people come to our environment to test that product, which we know if you get people into your environment, you have a much better idea of converting them. And that could be a digital or physical environment, it doesn't have to always be in store. So there are those elements. I think there's very few companies that can do it alone. And then the larger, the more complex you become, the more you appreciate the need to work with partners. Obviously, we as amongst everyone else has huge vendor relationships, but what I'm talking about is more partnership relationships. And Dick's has a lot of opportunities and problems, and there's a lot of innovation on the side that I think could make sense for us. But I don't think, again, I don't know if definitely is not a one size fits all. I think to your point of also, and I'm sure most of your entrepreneurs and folks that listen appreciate, like, ultimately they need to do what's best for them. And so it's a little bit, what are you looking for from the partnership, and whether that's dollars or advice or distribution or, whatever it may be, or customer, finding the people who have the right match of what you need is by far your most important element. Because if that doesn't work, it's never going to serve the company if you're constantly pulling in a different direction from where your partner wants you to pull.
Yeah, no, it's got to be balanced. It's got to be a two-way street. And so, listen, thank you for that. And I want to jump into some other topics, but just take a moment to welcome anyone who's listening live on LinkedIn. It's a fascinating conversation with Shahab Salemy, who's at Dick's Sporting Goods as a VP of Product and Design, 10 plus years at Nike, and also a very esteemed career track before that. You went to business school as well, Shahab?
I did.
And where'd you go to business school?
Wharton.
At Wharton. Okay. A Colombian Wharton guy, double Ivies. You still playing soccer, by the way?
I did. I had our first match for the fall season on Sunday.
Awesome.
This past
awesome. I want to get into some of that. But again, anyone who's listening, please feel free to share it forward. This is invaluable advice from a seasoned technology and marketing executive. I mean, it's a lot of just cross-functional areas, but seems to be, as Shahab's been talking about, this digital transformation and his role for 10 plus years across two of the top firms, top companies in the sporting goods industry. So we'll go on. Hopefully, definitely, I'll make sure we cap it, before the top of the hour. But just to shift a little bit, some questions. First of all, what'd you think, a little off the cuff, about the movie Air? Given your experience with Nike, did you feel, and the executives and the people there, did it feel like a good portrayal of the culture?
Yeah, I think it was. There's I'm blanking on the individual's name. As kind of a seasoned Nike alum who, as the movie was coming out and viewing, he was actually on LinkedIn, like, posting, here's what was real versus what was not. And so it was a nice little flow of that. And I think there was, if I had to, in reading that, some of which I knew, much of which I didn't, I would say it's like the story is probably like 80% accurate. And there's, 20% Hollywood, which I think is probably expected. I don't think it was, presented as a true depiction of exactly what happened. But I think generally, it is right. I think it really spoke to the spirit of the company, which is, to take risks, to innovate, to look for new ways of innovating. Innovation is as the movie depicted, it wasn't just about product. It was about product. It was about branding. It was around the business model behind it. All the things were different pieces of that. So, it was as much of a a movie about business as it was about sport or Michael Jordan. And I think that is really the spirit of most very successful companies, is that, it's not about, I always, when I talk to members of my team when we're having a challenge, and like, never look at a problem, look around the problem. Because when you look at a problem, sometimes you think about, if it's 1 + 1, it has to equal 2, and you just keep on trying to make it equal 2. And the real big problems are never that simple. The reality is you have to kind of look around the problem and really try to figure out, like, well, what am I trying to solve, and how can I solve it? And I think you think about, like, using Air as an example, their problem, the statement was like, how do we become more relevant and build our basketball franchise? It focused on an individual, but even when you focus on an individual, there's multiple dimensions on how you'd have to do that. Like, well, what is his and his family's intrinsic value? How do you want to present to them? Is it just about product? Like, what's the brand around that? How do we think differently? How do you give some space? How do you take risks? To the notion of the movie when they talked about, we're going to pay the fines to the NBA, and we're going to do something that others wouldn't do. Because if you looked at a problem, you could say, well, how do we make the best looking shoe that has this much white on it? If you looked around the problem, you'd say, well, wait a minute, we can do something, we're going to get fined, but think about the brand recognition we'll get and how that was really in the spirit of who we are. And so I think when I try to employ that with myself and with others, don't be so myopic on what it is, as much as allow yourself the time and freedom to ask why not, and to give some space to go do that. And I think that's where the real innovation happens. If not, we would all be still going and, renting DVDs if it wasn't for Netflix. Like, I mean, you have to think differently to truly kind of, bend the curve.
Yeah, man. Listen, that movie, and I appreciate what you're saying there. This is definitely a case. It's like its own little MBA program could be built in entrepreneurship and brand building and across the board. So many lessons from that. And by the way, anyone who's listening, if you have any questions for Shahab at the end, I want to leave a few minutes for a question or two. Speaking of that, now transitioning from that, I mean, it's like you said, it's more than just about the athlete, because in this day and age, pay per tweet, and every athlete has their agents and management and price tag, right? So there's a lot of, I don't want to say cheap ways, but like, yeah, there's just a price level, right? Based on the eyeballs and the audience. And there's all kinds of ways to do it. So that was one lesson, seeing what happened. And maybe that's like a once in a lifetime type of thing. But now let's talk about soccer and Messi, right? And like him coming over, because we could probably just have a whole conversation, me and you, on soccer and that. But the so-called Messi effect. I mean, what are your thoughts as a soccer fan, as I know you are, but even from a business standpoint, how he's doing deals in ways that aren't generally done, and maybe it's a generational talent that can command that kind of value.
I mean, I think the deals, I think it really comes back to, if Messi doesn't perform on the field, none of it matters. So if he were to come and with all the fanfare and he's not fundamentally turning around the team and getting people, no one would care. It'd be a curiosity that would be an asterisk, and companies like Apple and Adidas and others like, why did we do that? It's really, so it starts with him. And I'd say like, that's true of most things. Like the essence of who he is in his talent and obviously his work, and that everything around him is what exemplifies that. So it's not just the idea that he's not only an amazing player, but he's an amazing teammate. And I think that goes a few ways. It's not only that he's an amazing teammate, but his style is so revolutionary that it makes people think differently about the game. The whole, the notion that everyone talks a lot about is like, the Messi walk, like he's barely moving, but when he does, but he's constantly examining this idea that people are playing many times against themselves in a game or against a history of a game. He's playing against everyone in the moment. His evaluation of how people are in the moment is a completely different way of thinking about, soccer or many sports than, right? So like, then you start getting to like the business side of it. I think it's interesting, but I also feel like anyone could create that structure, and saying to your point of like, going to the old days of like, to whether you talk about Jordan or you talk about George Foreman in the grill or 50 Cent in vitamin water, this idea of Federer more recently and On Running, this idea of like my brand is important, but I bring more than just my name. I want to be associated with it. And if I'm associated with it, I want to be part of the upside of that experience. You know, Federer left Nike 4 years ago, a bit more than that, signed a deal with On Running, took 3% equity of On. On goes public, his 3% is worth 300 million. That happened in 3 years, right? And like, that's the idea of, he's like, I am more than that, right? Nike wasn't going to give him 3% of Nike, which is a whole different ballgame. But my point of it is like this notion of integrating more thoughtfully into the experience, I think is really an interesting way, particularly when you know you have that clout and that ability, right? This is like the LeBron effect in basketball, where he's like, he's more than an athlete. He's an icon. He wants to project of who he is and show that he can do more than just play basketball. He wants to demonstrate what he can do in other environments and how his brand is who he was. And you think about someone like LeBron, who was so conscious of that when he was 18, coming out on the cover of Sports Illustrated, you know, the chosen one, and through such a long career has managed that so thoughtfully. I think those are the things that are really interesting. When we look back on them, they seem so obvious, but you think about in his career, of LeBron's career, or many other athletes who come up, and we could, you know, talk about many in soccer who at a very young age, people were thought they were going to be the one. I mean, we all, the soccer fans, we remember Freddie Adu was going to be the next coming for US soccer. And you think about how his career was so mismanaged and how he's moved in the wrong environments. And part of it's his play, but also the environment which he's in led to a very disappointing journey for him, at least in soccer. I don't know Freddie's life, but, and you think about, you know, Ronaldo going to Saudi, Messi coming to the US, Mbappe staying in Europe, like they're all kind of trying to figure like what makes the best sense for them. A lot of it is around, I think, you know, like it's easy to make it in retrospect, I think like who's winning in that, but it's also what they also talk about winning. You know, Messi talks about his family. He talks about like, you know, Miami being much better for that environment. We know the next, you know, decade of soccer globally, the US is going to play a huge role in that with CONCACAF, with World Cup, you know, this elevation of the women's game in the US. You know, now we have, you know, dedicated the KC Current up in Kansas City is building the first women's only stadium for soccer. You know, that's, you think about when we were playing, this idea that there's going to be a league for women's professional sport for soccer, and then the teams were going to create dedicated stadiums for that would be fanciful. And today, and I'm good friends with the owners of the KC Current, and you know, and speaking to them, they're doing it not just as much like they love the sport and they want to promote the sport, they believe in the future of the game as an investment as much as anything else. They're not doing it just philanthropically. They see the same opportunity of that. So, you know, the current Bay Area team is owned by Sixth Street, another colleague and friend of mine who owns that same idea. Like they're investing because they see the future of the game. And so if you're Messi, now's the time to come to the US. There's such upside for soccer in the US. And I think he sees that, you know, in his third chapter or whatever, you know, of his career. What a great way to demonstrate. You know, he doesn't need to prove his skills to anyone else. Now let's show he can, you know, transform a country around a game.
Yeah, no, well said. And it's interesting, all the analogies you brought up, and there's hundreds more, and those are all great case studies. And I think coming from you and where you sit, you know, I think people should be really listening, you know, closely to that. And just an interesting juxtaposition, obviously with Air and Jordan, it was like before the guy was proven, and it was like taking a bet, you know, a bit of a gamble. Whereas with Messi, it's a different kind of risk, like you said, but it's obviously he's a proven entity, but what he's doing and the impact it's having in the early days, obviously it'd be great if Miami makes the playoffs, and we'll see, obviously knock on wood, he stays healthy. But I was in Bogota, Colombia a month ago for a conference, and hadn't thought about it till I was out there, because on all the televisions, I mean, they have their local league, but they were watching MLS, and the locals in there in Latam, it's like we talk about soccer in the US, but it's like, because Messi's playing now, they actually are paying attention to the MLS for the first time. And there's obviously a lot of Latin players already in the MLS, very good players from the other countries and Argentina as well. But now with Messi in, it gives them even more reason to watch. People were wearing pink shirts and the jerseys. So it's like this effect is like a multi-continental effect. Do you think it's going to actually elevate the level of play for US soccer at kind of a youth and
yeah, I mean, I
professional
think
level?
everything, yeah, and I'm sure there's others who are better students of the game of soccer going through the US, but what I would suggest is, soccer is still the number one participation sport amongst youth athletes. Like, and that's been the case for many years. Like, it's not a new phenomenon. The challenge has always been most of them, or many of them, are good athletes. They just happen to play soccer. They end up choosing other sports because they're inspired by other athletes, they're inspired by what they see on TV, or whatever else. And I think what we're seeing now is an ecosystem in the US where that young athlete, that 6-year-old, that 10-year-old is starting to see both the level increase as well as the opportunities for them increase, whether that's domestically or nationally. And it's fascinating. I was in Seattle a couple of weeks ago, and I was with my family there, and my 3 young nieces, and we went to go see UW women's team was playing Yale. The level of collegiate soccer, I'm just looking at the female level, was so much better. And candidly, going back to like when we played, like felt competitive to what like our style like 25 years ago. And you think about that, and so like now you have like I have nieces in high school and junior high and younger. They look at that and now they're inspired by what the game can be. And the bar is so much higher. And like same idea, like when we now watch collegiate soccer, or even the US has gotten, the US 94 team, couldn't get a goal against today's team. I mean, there's not even a comparison. And so I think that's what's really interesting is you're seeing the level really rise, and you've seen the opportunity also rise. And when you see those things come together, when practice meets opportunity, like that's when the magic happens. And so that's why I'm optimistic of the journey. Will the US ever, MLS ever compete with Premier League or La Liga or League One? Maybe not. I mean, it's tough to, at some levels, that's generational. You have to get Messi's to come here when they're 13, not come here when they're 36.
Right.
But it's going to be a competitive league. The one thing the US always, is willing to do is to put money at the situation. So like, we're afforded a very stable, economy and a lot of dollars to support the game. And just like I was alluding to before, like investors are starting to put their money into the game. That's a really clear sign of the fact that they see value. So I'm optimistic. It would be great to one day see the US actually be competitive at a World Cup, truly competitive. And it's fun. Like I said, 20 years ago, I would never think about watching US soccer. Today it's like, every game's interesting. So
now you got to have that Apple Plus subscription.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I know every time I watch, I feel I put another few cents into Messi's pocket.
Yeah. And like you said about the level of play, I mean, just look at some of the guys we played with who now have kids, right? Like the young Balsamo, the young Sullivans. I mean, Balsamo's moved to lacrosse, but they're, these great athletes we played with, now their kids at the next generation are, like you just said, another notch, another level above. Just look at what, Brendan's boys are doing, and talk about possibly some of the future of the sport. For that young talent, those 13-year-olds staying in this country or staying connected to the program, whether it's national team or maybe some club ball. I mean, maybe for the chance to play with or against guys like Messi.
You think about, in last World Cup, like when the US put their, 11 on the field in the first game, I think 10 of them played in Europe. Yeah. Right. So like this idea, like even like the US game obviously is also getting better because players are going and getting great experience and coming back either national team or maybe a bit later in MLS. So I think this fluidity that we're starting to see, I think is also helping the global game, because we also know like different leagues have different styles. They have different players. Like you're starting to, it's not so, I remember when like Landon Donovan went overseas, and one of the reasons he came back, I think, to LA, he said he was homesick and like he wanted an environment. And like that's great for him. It's not a criticism, But this idea of like, it used to feel very foreign in all walks of life to like, I'm going to go overseas, I'm going to be in a place I don't know. But now with this idea of how many of our cultures have started to come together in many ways, and this idea, it's not hard to kind of see yourself in multiple environments. I think it's also allowed young athletes that luxury of thinking about how I can now expand my reach and not feel so pressured. That doesn't put in challenge my personal goals with my professional goals.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting dynamic as well, that we're seeing. And that's, we're getting into like a whole other dimension of like how athletes are getting paid and the flexibility have, and we could spend an hour talking about NIL deals and how like that's changing the game and at a younger level and giving people more options and where they play and how they promote themselves. And so it's a fun time to be in sports. We could talk about sports gambling. We talk about Aaron Rodgers' Achilles. I mean,
we can go in a lot of directions. I want to have you back on. I know you guys got a busy schedule, but actually, a couple things. One is that's one of the questions. I saw a couple questions streaming in, and I want to save it for the end. But since you mentioned NIL, I'll just throw it in now. Any advice you'd give, like potential, again, going back to partners, vendors, or just even those young athletes, like for this, like utilizing NIL athletes in their marketing?
I think, and again, I would be wrong for me to give advice to any person individually, but if I were to give like some general advice is like, realize every athlete is a brand as early as they start playing. Like you are a brand, whether you have an NIL deal, whether you don't, the style you play, how you promote yourself on the field, how you promote yourself in your community, all those things really matter. And so when we think about, and again, using LeBron as the example, he's an easy one, but his thoughtfulness about his brand at every moment, how he was going to be perceived, what partnerships he was going to sign. A lot of it is very curated and thought, because it wasn't about such and such is going to give me X amount and I could do Y. It was about how am I thinking about the long game? And for really the great athletes, that's so critical, because as we know, we're a fickle community. We love and hate our athletes just as quickly. We put them on pedestals and we knock them down as fast as we put them up. And so that association of who you partner with is really important, because now, as we know, like NIL, it's the Wild West. Rules change every year. What's really true? Like, what can you sign up for? All those things you have to stay very on top of and be very thoughtful about that. And also appreciate, like, once you do put your name on something, now you're associated with that brand in some way. And if you think about your longer term career, how should you be thinking about that? Is that a brand you want to be thoughtful of? Is that a place that makes sense for you? Because ultimately, and I think that's where I'll go back to partnership is so important. When you find the right partner, all the other stuff candidly becomes easy. Finding the wrong partner, and you will spend your time. I've done a lot of M&A and business development. I always remind myself, and I always like tell others when I'm doing deals, is pick your partner, don't pick your deal. We spend so much time negotiating contracts and like clauses and out clauses and all these things. And I'm always like, I understand it. We pay lawyers a lot of money to do that. But to me, it's a lot of wasted energy, because if you pick the right partner, you will find your journey through those tough times. They will be with you. They will renegotiate. They will work with you. If you find the wrong partner, doesn't matter how tight your deal is, they will find a way around it. They will be a thorn in your side. They will countersue. You'll have a horrible journey. And so you think about NIL, you're essentially entering into all these micro partnerships. So think about not only the brand and the dollars that you may achieve, but really think about, is this someone that you trust? Is it an environment that makes sense for you? Is this a place you think you could potentially grow? And oh, by the way, if you outgrow them, will they understand that and appreciate that, hey, we're a point in time partnership. You're now a different kind of beast. That I think is as important as, and again, it's easy for me to say, I don't know what everyone's situation is, your environment may be different that forces you into different places, but that would be my kind of general thinking of NIL.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear from you on that. And so I take it Dick's has an active and proactive strategy in that space. It's not like a let's watch and see, or is it How
Well, I
would
think
you
we're aware of. I mean, obviously, I mean, you have to know. I mean, Dick's and Nike are very different. When you think about, Nike has a lot of NIL, athletes, but Nike's business model is very much is an athlete-driven business model. Dick's, we have, athletes as our ambassadors, but it's a different model, so it's not as relevant in a Dick's environment as maybe in a Nike environment, where the thousands of people are working on finding the next great athlete, and how early can you partner with them, and what does that deal look like, is very different in that world than, let's say, Dick's.
Gotcha. Great. Well, my last topic for you, and this could be brief, is and we've talked about a lot of different names and athletes, and I know, as per your time at Nike, and I'm sure Dick's as well, you've come across and got to be at some of the best sporting events and meet and greet, and I've seen some of your pictures with the different athletes. Any one or two that you can share that were like just either your experience or who you found to be just fascinating to meet, or that was personally like touched you in some way?
I mean, I would say, and I didn't spend a lot of time with this athlete, but he's by far my most inspired athlete of, for me, the last, could be my like adult generation, would be Eliud Kipchoge, who, the Kenyan runner who has, on professionally is by far the most prolific marathoner of our generation, maybe of all time. He has demonstrated an ability, he's the only man to run sub 2 hours for a marathon, not on a professional course, but in a curated environment. We had worked with him on that journey, and Nike has been a huge supporter of Kipchoge for many years, from early running to where he's now more of an ambassador, and he still competes. He's competing in Berlin coming up. I think why I think he's so inspiring is, one, obviously his physical abilities are just so aspirational, in terms of, not that any of us could do that, but just his ability. He talks about this idea that you really have no limits, like in to test that theory. And so this idea that, once upon a time we thought that, no one could break the 4-hour, mile marker, they would die, or like women couldn't run marathons, and these kind of ideas. And his idea to constantly test that idea, 2-hour marathon, was conceived as one of those ideas, and his ability to say it's possible, and he hopes in his lifetime it will actually be achievable by many. So that on one side is incredibly inspirational. The way he shows up to the community of running, you can think like running sometimes can be a very individualized sport. You don't really think about it, particularly with marathoning. You can kind of think about it in terms of it's one person versus a clock, in many times in some athletes, but his concept of how he's built really a collegiate environment of running, both, in his own, home in his country of Kenya, but also how he's become an ambassador to others and really thinking about it as a community, I think is incredibly inspiring. And he's also one of the most humble human beings you would ever meet, in terms of how he lives his life, how he prioritizes his family, how he realizes like you don't really need much to be happy. Happiness really comes from inside. It really doesn't come from anything else. For all those reasons, it's he's like at the top of my list of that. I love a lot of other athletes for different reasons, but holistically it'd be Kipchoge.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shahab, and really thanks for taking the time. We're longtime friends, and as I was joking in the post today, like the only way I can get in your calendars to do a podcast with you. I know how busy you are. Hopefully, I'll come down at some point. It's great that you're back in Texas, man. How does it feel to be back home or close to home?
It's great. Yeah, I mean, it's Austin's a great town. We're coming off the summer heat, which is always the challenge of the Texas summers. But I'm excited to be kind of central and close to family, and it's a good experience so far.
Good stuff, man. Well, next time you're coming up to New York, let me know. And otherwise, maybe I'll get down for a Cowboy game. How about them Cowboys, man?
Yeah. Put the 40 nickel on the Giants. Yeah, it was a good match. Yeah. Well, I'll be in New York for the marathon in November. So
cool.
I'll look you up.
All right, man. Listen, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And have a great rest of the day.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Arman.
Okay. Peace.